Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Brazil Update webinar. I am Sueli Bonaparte, founding president of the Brazil-Florida Business Council, an independent, not-for-profit business association based in Tampa, Florida. Through its role as a business membership organization, the Brazil-Florida Business Council remains a foremost public forum for discussion and debate on Brazil's and Florida's business issues. The Brazil Update webinar series was designed to hear from the most respected and knowledgeable experts about Brazil's political turmoil and economic downturn. Discuss what needs to be done to get the economy back on track and question if this is the right moment to invest when the country is facing the worst recession in decades. A political crisis and corruption scandals have paralyzed the government, with President Dilma Rousseff suspended to face impeachment trial and her replacement, acting President Michel Temer, facing a very difficult time. Since coming to power less than 3 weeks ago, acting President Michel Temer has already lost two members of his administration to corruption investigation linked to state oil company Petrobras. Their resignations is a timely reminder that the corruption investigations transcend party lines. Until this month, the benchmark Bovespa stock index was one of the top performing bourses this year, after jumping some 45% between the end of January and the end of April. Bovespa is set to end the month of May 10% lower, the biggest monthly decline since September 2014. It is, therefore, well-timed that we have today, June 1st, our guest speaker, Will Landers, who oversees BlackRock's Latin American Investment Fund. Brazil represents about 50% of the firm's Latin American portfolio, which is around $2 billion. It will be very timely to hear from an investor point of view how to comprehend Brazil's economic and political upheaval and be bold under this formidable scenario. Lenders will discuss areas of opportunities and risks in the Brazilian equity market and outline the challenges the nation faces to move beyond its current political and economic crisis. Will Landers serves as a managing director, head of Latin America equity team, and senior portfolio manager at BlackRock Inc. Landers also serves as a fund manager at BlackRock Investment Management UK. In addition, he is a fund manager at BlackRock Advisors LLC. Previously, Landers was a research analyst in the research division at Credit Suisse. He served as an equity analyst in the research division at Lehman Brothers Holdings and Barclays Capital. Landers graduated from the Georgetown University. He was born in São Paulo, Brazil. Before I introduce to you our guest speaker, I would like to inform you that the program will be as follows. Will Landers will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by Q&A session. At this moment, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you all our distinguished speaker, Will Landers. Seja bem-vindo, Will.
Muito obrigado, Sueli. Thank you very much for your kind words and for your invitation to speak with your members. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon. What I thought I would do is spend a quick few minutes just giving a bit of a feedback or going back in time as to what made Brazil work, what made Brazil move from being the country of the future, país do futuro, to being a country that had arrived and had made investors very interested in what was going on in the country. And then how do we get from that point when Brazil was on the cover of The Economist and everything was going fine to the point where we are today, where Brazil has been in a recession, really into a depression for the last 2 years. And why, for the first time in 3 years, I'm once again telling clients that it's time to look at Brazil with the new administration that took over a few weeks ago. So going back in time, and we're going back into the mid-90s. I mean, what got back Brazil into investors' radar screens was the Real Plan, started by then Finance Minister Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who then became president in 1994. The Real Plan had 3 pillars that really helped Brazil move away from hyperinflation into a country where inflation slowly went down into the single digits, and we saw real growth happening on a consistent basis for several years. And those 3 pillars were inflation targeting, which basically meant that the central bank had only one job, and that job was to keep inflation under control. And that target was eventually brought down to 4.5% with a band of plus or minus 2% as an acceptable range. So from 2.5% to 6.5%, it would be seen as the central bank doing its job. And Brazil was able to keep inflation in that level for several years until the last couple of years when we went above the top of the band. The second and as important, if not more important, was fiscal responsibility, was maintaining a primary surplus in the government accounts, which basically means maintaining a surplus before paying back debts, paying back the fiscal debt. And the reason for that is that by maintaining a primary surplus, then they were able to bring debt to GDP to levels to lower and lower levels. And what we saw is that this culminated in 2008, before the crisis here in the United States, when Brazil was finally, for the first time in a long time, put into an investment grade rating because its accounts were in order, the economy was doing well, and that the GDP level had gone to very acceptable levels. And the last pillar of the Real Plan was maintaining a free trading currency, allowing the Real to really be the buffer for any internal or external shocks that would cause any problem for the economy. And that worked well for many, many years. And we saw periods like in 2002, before President Lula was elected, when the Real reached 4, in 2008, when we had the U.S. crisis here, where the Real got from 2 to 2.5, from 1.5 to 2.5 very quickly. And then most recently, when the Real went over 4. And one of the reasons why that the country is able to do that is that during the good times, during the periods of economic stability and economic growth, Brazil collected a lot of foreign reserves. And today, Brazil still has a lot more reserves than actual dollar debt outstanding. There's a lot of real debt that's linked to inflation, linked to the Selic rate, but there's more dollar debt, more reserves than dollar debt outstanding. So even when the currency goes up and down this much, it doesn't create a big problem for the accounts as it would have pre the Real Plan, when Brazil was basically a debtor to the world and was rolling the debt very quickly. And if the market shut down, as they have from time to time, as they have for this most recent episode, it would create a lot of problems for the country. So then when we look at over the last 10, 15 years, when President Lula came to power in 2002, there was always obviously a lot of concern that Brazil was going to follow Argentina into some type of populist policies and close down even further and possibly even declare a default as Argentina had done so. And you saw all the macro numbers in Brazil go out of whack. But the reality was that what we saw from President Lula in his first administration was basically a continuation of what President Fernando Henrique Cardoso had put in place for the previous 8 years. And some of the social programs started by President Cardoso were increased by President Lula, most notably the Bolsa Familia, which really was a big help in reducing poverty among the most poor in Brazil, which are still a significant part of the population. And what we saw during the Lula years was also that we were in the middle of a commodity boom, the commodity super cycle, and Brazil being one of the biggest producers of iron ore, also being a significant producer of steel, of pulp. It benefited from this super cycle that was obviously pushed up by China and the significant growth seen there. And with that, it was able to build the reserves that I talked about before. A lot of investments were going on, but the economy definitely benefited from that. And what we saw was that also during the same period, inflation came very much under control. The currency went from 4 reais to the dollar back in 2002 to a low of 150 right before the crisis in 2008 when Brazil was pushed up to investment grade. And during that period, and really through President Lula's second term, there was a significant growth in Brazil's middle class. So it went from a country that had about 40% of its population living below the poverty line to a country that by the end of President Lula's second term, over 40 million people had ascended into the middle class. So it became much more of a domestically driven economy that obviously has its ups and downs related to what's going on internationally. But it really became an economy that was mostly driven by what was going on in the domestic side of the equation. And what we were seeing there was that inflation was very much under control and running right around the middle of the 4.5% target from the central bank. You had GDP growth rates that were running, not Asia-like, but were running around the 3% range, plus or minus a little bit. And employment was growing very fast. So with all that, real wages were growing. The middle class was expanding. Retail sales were growing. The Selic rate got to an all-time low of 7.25%, which helped with credit availability. Mortgages were being made available for the first time in a long time for a significant portion of the population. So Brazil was in a virtuous circle that was moving very, very well. But for some reason then, when the administration switched over from President Lula to President Rousseff, there was a change in the direction of the economy. And what many people had feared in 2002 in terms of what it meant for the PT to come to power at that point started to slowly materialize in Brazil in 2010 throughout President Rousseff's administrations. And that basically meant a much more active state in the economy, state intervention in several sectors. The BNDES with this whole idea of creating superpowers in various sectors, credit being maintained artificially low by the governmental banks, whether it was Banco do Brasil or Caixa Econômica. BNDES creating all kinds of imbalances as well by providing very cheap financing, not only for long-term infrastructure projects, but also for machinery and for some other types of short-term loans that really wasn't what those programs were built for. So what started happening was slowly an unwinding of the fiscal balances that we were having in Brazil. So you saw the primary surplus coming down from a peak of about 150 billion reais when President Lula passed the reins on to President Rousseff, to at the time of her reelection being close to a zero balance, and then for the last 2 years being very negative territory. At the same time, the central bank was trying to keep inflation under control, and with that, it was increasing rates in order to fight the inflation that was coming through the economy because of cheap credit, because of the size of government getting bigger, and also because of the fact that the currency was slowly devaluing and it was having a negative impact on inflation. So you had the one side of the government on the central bank side trying to control inflation by becoming more hawkish, where we're increasing rates, and then on the other side you had the finance ministry spending more money and encouraging the banks under its control to do so. So you had this imbalance that was creating a credit bubble that eventually caused a lot of trouble in Brazil, and you had the central bank increasing rates, which at the end of the day, the biggest borrower in Selic is the government, so it was causing more and more trouble in terms of the deficit of the government growing. And this was creating, it coincided with a period where China was slowing down, so demand for commodities was also slowing down, so you saw the price of commodities coming down significantly. And the biggest investor in Brazil by far was Petrobras, with a capex program which peaked around $40 billion, which is about $250 million per day. I remember meeting with a company when they were doing a capital raise at the end of in 2009, and just trying to understand where the controls were for such a huge capex program. It was clear that they were still working on this, and but we do think we have a good control over it. Well, that was like the last bucket, the last shoe to drop, which was the corruption scandal that hit Brazil right after the re-election of President Rousseff. The Lava Jato investigation really started to hit the headlines strongly a few days, weeks after the election, the re-election of President Rousseff, and that was really just sucking out the last big investor that was spending significant money in infrastructure in Brazil, which was Petrobras. And with it, it brought all the infrastructure companies, the big construction companies, along with it. So at the end of the day, you had no construction company in Brazil that wasn't involved, or none of the big ones anyway. You had Petrobras having to reduce investments significantly. You had this investigation that started on the private side, but then it quickly moved into which politicians were involved. All kinds of rumors about who was and who wasn't involved. And this all culminated, obviously, with several high-profile individuals being sent to jail or being indicted. And this is still an ongoing problem that's going on. So at the end of the day, when we looked at President Rousseff's second term, growth slowed down significantly. So 2014, from a peak of 7.5% in 2010, where President Lula kind of passed the reins over to President Rousseff, by 2014, the economy was basically not growing. It grew 0.1%. Last year, it declined 3.8%. These are in real terms, in reais. And this year is expected to fall another 3.5% or so. So by any measure, this is really a quasi-depression. And then when you do this, these numbers in dollars, the numbers got even smaller. And that magical number of $10,000 per capita GDP number, which was one that thought that once Brazil crossed that, it would never see that again. We're well below that again. And most estimates, unless we have a significant appreciation of the currency, which doesn't look likely, it doesn't look like we're going to get to that level anytime in the near future. So in the last 6 months or so, the process of impeachment started to gain steam, and then it lose steam. And while one would think that this is all related to Petrobras, especially given the fact that President Rousseff was the chairman of Petrobras for about 7 years, the reason for the impeachment process itself it's really related to fiscal accounts and overspending by the government, which wasn't authorized by Congress, which is punishable eventually by impeachment. So it was the legality that was found by the Congress to start the impeachment process. But the reality was that this process only became possible because the population was very much behind it, with some numbers as high as 70% of the population being in favor of a changing government, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're in favor of Interim President Temer, but they were in favor of removing President Rousseff, given all the problems that we've had and the fact that when we look at this economic activity, the economy is not growing. When we look at inflation last year, inflation went back into the double digits for the first time since 2003. When we look at unemployment, which had been holding up pretty well despite the slowdown in the economy in the last 18 months, we've seen unemployment jump from 7% to 11%, and a lot of people had this number continue to grow into the teens with President Rousseff staying in office. So with all this, there was a lot of public support, which culminated with Vem pra Rua, the Come to the Streets movement, bringing anywhere between 1 and 3 million people, depending on whose numbers you believe, into the last big manifestation that happened in the streets in Brazil. And with that, then Congress moved forward with the impeachment process, and 2.5 weeks ago voted in favor of impeaching President Rousseff. So So what happens now? President Temer has taken over as interim president. The process is moving on through all the steps that they have to move on. In the Senate, the president has until today to present her defense, and after that, we'll have a period where witnesses can be brought up and all kinds of questionings. And so there's a lot of procedures that have to take place in the Senate now during the months of June and July. And by the most recent estimates that I've seen, around the first week in August, maybe August 1st or 2nd, this is when the earliest that the Senate could actually vote to finalize the impeachment procedure. And why is that important, given that the President Temer has already assumed office? He's already changed the entire cabinet. He's got his new central bank president that's going to be gone through the sabatina, the questioning in Senate in the next couple of days. It is important because I think there's a lot of investors, both in Brazil and outside, that still have a fear that this interim title could create trouble if President Sef was to return to office. We saw this in January when the expectation was that there wasn't going to be any impeachment, and the market sold off significantly, and then emerging markets started to do a little bit better, and then in March, when the impeachment process started to pick up steam, Brazil became one of these up-performing markets, as William mentioned earlier. We're still up on the year in the double digits, which is a nice difference from what we've seen over the last couple of years. But clearly, the market hasn't moved up since the impeachment process started, and it's because so far we've had some wins, but it's I'd say that it's a tied score right now between the wins, the goals for and against the scored by the Temer administration so far. I think in terms of what's the positives that we've seen so far is the quality of the team that he's been able to put in place on the finance side, with Henrique Meirelles as the finance minister, Ila Goldfein as the central bank president, credible folks at the BNDES, at Petrobras, at Caixa, at Banco do Brasil, and as importantly, when you look at some of the second tier people brought in to some of the key ministries, also bringing some highly technical people that we think will be able to move in the right direction with some of the reforms that Brazil needs to happen. What are some of the negatives? Obviously, as Willie mentioned, two ministers have already been forced to resign because of their implications that they were involved somehow with the Lava Jato investigation, or at least were working to try to slow it down. There are a couple more in the cabinet that are involved, and I think that is the biggest risk for this government, is that with the plea agreements being signed supposedly most recently by the Odebrecht group, there could be a lot more names that get brought up with these pleas. And what we've seen is that while on the one side you have to applaud all the work done by the judiciary in terms of investigating without any apparent political bias, I do think that in some of the instances, people that really didn't have anything other than their name being mentioned on a tape, they were brought up for investigation very publicly, and then proven that they weren't involved. But at that point, most people are being assumed, if your name gets mentioned, that you're assumed that you are guilty in some way. It is very difficult today to put your hand in the fire for anybody involved with any of these operations. As we saw, it was very tough for President Temer to even put in 22 minister-level people that didn't have any involvement, and 10% or 2 of them are already gone. But I think that's the risk, is that if these things don't somehow get settled and we get too close to an end to it, as Judge Moro had mentioned it would be by the end of the year, this could be something that would hold back the economy significantly. But why am I positive on this? Is because I do think that anybody but President Dilma right now running the country will do a better job than what she was doing, given the fact that she wasn't able to get anything done through Congress. She didn't have any political will to work with the Congress and the Senate, so nothing was getting done. And right now, what we need is reforms on the fiscal side to allow the government to reduce expenditures, which right now are tied to by law The expenses are very much tied that you can't reduce them. So we're looking. We need a congressional vote in order to allow these expenses to be reduced versus where they were budgeted. At some point, I think you are going to need, at least for the short term, a new tax, whether it's the CPMF or another type of tax. You're going to need a tax in order to make the accounts whole until the country starts growing again. But if we're able to get some of these reforms done, eventually you need pension reform because Brazil already spends about as much money as a percentage of GDP as Japan does for retirements, even though it's a much younger population. Getting some of these early wins through Congress, I think, will bring confidence back to investors, especially to strategic investors looking to invest in Brazil's infrastructure, which is very much needed. And with that, I think that will be a source of growth, along with the growth that we have been seeing from the export side, where with the real at 360, Brazil is much more competitive than it was when the real was at 250. I think those will be the two areas that will help Brazil get back into positive growth in 2017, and hopefully even faster growth in 2018. At which point then we'll have the next presidential election. But I think if at that point then the country is moving in the right direction, that we should be able to have a market-friendly president elected, as we've seen happen in Argentina at the end of last year, as we're going to see happen in Peru on Sunday this week, and as we saw happen in other places throughout the region over the last couple of years. But Tully, let me stop here, and so just one final thing in terms of the stock market. As we are up still some 28% in dollar terms from the low that we saw in January, but we're still down about 67% from the high that we saw back in 2010, and it was a very similar level in dollar terms that we saw in 2008 before when Brazil was awarded an investment grade rating by the rating agencies. So there's a lot of upside left in Brazilian equities. Clearly, a lot of this upside that we saw from before was from commodity companies like Petrobras and Vale, which I don't think we're going to get to those same valuations. But when we look at some of the large banks, when we look at the retailers, when we look at this new Brazil that was created through the IPO process in the last decade, I think that there's still plenty of upside for this market. And even when we look at a recent highs, when the market is about 30 to 40% below where it was in dollar terms when people thought that President Rousseff was going to lose the election back in 2014. So for all those reasons, and the fact that we do think that with the right folks in place, we can get Brazil going in the right direction again. Brazil is a bit broken, but it's not as broken as Argentina was when President Macri took over. So I think that the fixes are still very doable if we have the willingness of both executive and the legislative to work together. So with that, Shirley, I'll pass it back to you and see if there's any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your timely and enlightening presentation. At this time, we will start the Q&A session, and I would like to ask the first question. You manage a $2 billion portfolio overweighted in Brazil under this two not certain and not rosy backdrop. How can you sleep?
Oh, I sleep very well. Look, I think the reason why we were underweight Brazil as late as mid-March of this year. We went into this year with a very negative view of the Brazilian equity market, not a particularly cheap market, one where earnings were expected to still be very negative this year, where the real was expected to be somewhere in the fours, if not closer to 5 reais to the dollar. So that was going to eat up any earnings growth that was coming through the market, and where the prospect of President Rousseff finishing her term meant that we would be finishing 2018 with gross debt to GDP around 80 or 90%, several notches below investment grade. And without really, with a much deeper hole to dig out of for the new administration that would be elected after 2018. The reason why we became more positive is that with the changes in government, we're moving those reforms and those changes up by 2 years. We saw the real strengthen quite a bit from 4.25 to below 3.5, now to 360, which means that earnings are going to be better than what was expected for before. And when we look at 2017, we can actually see real earnings growth, and not just earnings growth related to FX appreciation like we see this year. And when I look at people like Henrique Meirelles, Ilan Goldfein, Maria Silva BNDES, and a few others who have joined this administration, These are all people that have a lot of reputation on the line, and I don't think they would have joined the government unless they really thought that they were going to be able to get the country back into a better path over the next year or so. So with that, I think that Brazil looks attractive here, not particularly cheap on a short-term basis, but if you look at it on a medium-term basis, I think the valuations look very attractive.
Great. As a follow-up of my question, Will, you deal with foreign investors on a daily basis. What are the main concerns regarding Brazil's current political and economic situation?
I think the biggest concern is that nobody really understands what's going on the political side, and it's even for us to look at it on a daily basis. You need to follow it almost on a minute-by-minute basis because things change very quickly. It's very hard to explain to somebody that the president of the largest bank or the second largest bank in Brazil was indicted on some weird tax issues. The whole Zelotes thing and Carfi that Bradesco was involved with yesterday. So there's still a lot of question marks there. The fact that you have an interim president and the impeachment process hasn't really finished yet. So are we sure that we're gonna these changes that are happening now they're gonna follow through? Are we sure the Congress is gonna work with? The fact is that we still have to speak more about the politics and the top down in Brasilia than necessarily about what's going on at the company level and whether we like it more than Bradesco or we like Ambev more than Henner or whatever it is that we like. I'm just using an example. I'm not saying those are those positions. And at the end of the day, I think people really want to invest in a country where you can say, look, the growth is going to be like this and it's going to be sustainable and these are the companies that are going to benefit from it and this is how we're positioned in the portfolio. Right now, it's still very much a technical position trying to play these ups and downs in the market based on what's going on the political side. But I'm very hopeful that over the next 3 to 6 months, we'll have more certainty on that side and we can kind of stop reading the political pages of the blogs and the newspapers and can focus more on the economic side. And I think at that point, then you're going to start attracting a lot of investors. You mentioned we have $2 billion in investments today. We were at $11 billion at the end of 2010, and we've saw significant outflows, significant amount of clients leaving the region. And we've had small net inflows over the last 3 months, but they're very small compared to the net outflows that we've had over the last 5 years. So I think people are still taking a wait and see attitude. Appreciate the fact that you're positive, but I still want to have a little bit more certainty before I'm going to make a significant investment to the country again.
We're going to take some questions now that we received via email. In 2016, we have been observing the Brazilian stock market rebounding from historical lows to significant gains in US dollars. How much of this is rising commodities, improving macroeconomics, or simply politics?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of coincided that when we look at when the Bovespa started to move up, it was late January when the Fed moved to a more dovish type of scenario. China started to show a little bit better economic figures, and you saw oil and iron ore and most commodities hit bottom. And Brazil kind of moved along with the emerging markets overall. So it wasn't, like in the last 5 years, it wasn't just that people didn't want to invest in Latin America, they didn't want to invest in Brazil. They didn't want to invest in emerging markets overall. And within the emerging markets, Brazil was probably one of the least favored countries because of all the political concerns that we talked about, especially in the last couple of years. But I think that what happened was that in March, when it became very clear that the impeachment had a better than 50% chance of passing, that's when the Brazilian market outperformed emerging markets significantly. There was like a 3-day period where if you weren't invested, you missed out on a 15 to 20% move because and it culminated with President Lula being indicted or at least being brought in questioning on that Friday in third week in March, if I'm not mistaken. And that was the period when Brazil, and from there, for the next couple weeks, Brazil outperformed significantly because it became very clear that the impeachment process was going to move forward. So that's when politics took over, and it was much more about Brazil specific than necessarily what was going on in the commodity world. I think what we saw in May was a little bit of a hangover post the impeachment process, as well as the fact that the economic figures coming out of China weren't that great. So it caused a bit of a pause in some of the commodities, not necessarily oil, but definitely in iron ore. You saw iron ore peak above $60 per ton and come quickly down. but below 50. And with that, obviously, Vale kind of comes right along with it. And also that put a little bit of pressure in some commodity currencies. A little less on the real again, but if you look at the Mexican peso, for example, last week the peso went from 17 and a quarter to 18 and a half almost overnight, which is obviously a huge move for any currency, but especially for one as liquid as the Mexican peso.
Great. Since we are talking commodities and oil, this question comes from a journalist who covers the oil sector. The question is, BlackRock sees the new government boosting Brazil's economy in the oil sector plays a big role. There is a bill in Congress that would open the pre-salt to more foreign investment. What else, aside from this bill, could the government do to liberalize the sector at a time when Petrobras cannot step up to the task?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are being talked about, and they are part of, I believe, of the new oil law that now Minister Serra, then Senator Serra, was talking about. Obviously you have this requirement that Petrobras has to be the operator and own at least 30% of any pre-salt area, and that's something that they're looking to remove, especially the part where, well, both of them really. Petrobras doesn't have the investment, doesn't have the balance sheet anymore to make new investments, or to be the operator in every area where there's pre-salt opportunities. So I think removing that is critical, and it would attract a lot of the majors in the world that have experience in deep sea drilling. The other one is the local content requirement, where it's up somewhere it changes from project to project, but somewhere in the 60s. Reducing that would also be critical in order to allow Petrobras and the new operators to have access to the best technology at the best price, and not be forced to buy from local suppliers, which have proven not to be able to deliver on time and on budget in most cases. So I think those are the two critical things that would liberalize further the oil sector and allow foreign investors, foreign strategic investors, other oil majors to invest more heavily into the Brazilian market.
Great. Since we are talking about Petrobras, let's move to the next question. As most Brazilian blue chips are state-run, how do you evaluate them under these unstable and uncertain circumstances in Brazil?
Look, I think obviously the large caps in Brazil were the ones that suffered the most during the downturn in the economy. Whether you're talking about the large banks or the large commodity companies, it's been a rough time for all companies in Brazil, but especially the large cap companies that have big dependency on either commodities, on the commodity cycle, or on the domestic side of the equation. Some of the smaller cap companies in retail and in other areas, fuel distribution, small mid caps really, they have done better. But the reality is that with this volatility, it's been the large cap stocks that have done the best or the worst, depending on what's going on in the market, because those are the ones where, on the one side, foreign investors who are looking to invest directly into Brazil will go to first. So you go through the big cap, the blue chip ADRs, and also these tend to be the largest stocks in the ETFs. And when we look at the flows, ETFs have been dominating flows not only in Brazil or Latin America or emerging markets, but throughout the world. In terms of making wholesale investment decisions, asset allocation decisions, both by retail as well as some institutional investors. So when we look at the AWZ, obviously the large caps make up a big chunk of it, and they tend to benefit more when flows come in and suffer more when flows come out of AWZ.
To the same point, what are the main factors that Brazil continues to attract major investors like you, BlackRock, and Mark Moody?
Look, I think for one thing, Brazil is still one of the biggest domestic economies in the world with 200 million people. It is a continental country with a lot of natural resources. It's got one of the best demographic pyramids, so we still have a very young population compared to most developed markets and even some of the emerging markets. When you compare Brazil's demographic pyramid with China or with Russia especially, Brazil is much more attractive, with much more looking like a pyramid, while the other ones look more skewed in the middle. And while a place like India might have a much bigger bottom to their to their pyramid. Unfortunately, that population still doesn't have the purchasing power that the Brazilian population has been able to develop over the last couple of decades. So while there's been a lot of that's been unwound from the gains in Brazil's domestic economy and middle class over the last 3 or 4 years under President Rousseff, it's still a vibrant and active segment of the economy, and one that I think that with a little bit of stability and getting back to growth, I think that they can go back to growing again. And I think one of the biggest benefits that you're going to see from the change in administration is that unemployment growth is going to slow down much more quickly, because it's still very expensive to hire and hire people in Brazil. So with the prospects of the economy actually improving more quickly than it would have otherwise, I think folks that held on to their employees until now will think twice before doing any type of headcount reduction. So I think with that, it's also going to be a positive for the economy. It's going to be a positive for credit. It's going to be a positive for everybody.
As a follow-up to the question that you just answered, the next question: Brazil continues to attract foreign investors due to the size of its economy, as you just mentioned, and opportunities available. But which other Latin American countries are getting more exposure right now? And how do you see the future of investing in emerging markets?
Look, I think when we look at Latin America, Brazil is by far the biggest economy, and it probably gets less than its fair share of investments because of all these political issues, and because Brazil is still a fairly closed economy. It's a place that's still tough place to do business, where you have a complicated tax system, where you have state taxes which compete with one another, and you have to have an army of accountants in order to be able to do business in Brazil, especially if you're going to be doing it in several different states. So I think one of the things that has been talked about is reducing the cost of doing business in Brazil, the so-called Brazil cost, and that's critical for Brazil to be able to attract even more FDI, and not just capital investments like the ones we do at BlackRock, but bringing FDI, foreign direct investment, into the industry, and not just like we've seen with the auto sector, where it was an investment that went into Brazil for consumption in Brazil, but actually make Brazil a potential destination for folks looking to invest and then use it as an export base. And obviously the opposite of that is Mexico. Mexico is one of the most open economies in the region. It's probably the most open economy in the region. It's one of the most open economies in the world. It's got a 24-hour trading currency. It has some issues in terms of the cost of doing business, but it's much further ahead than Brazil is. Obviously, having the partnership with the United States and Canada and NAFTA, it has created a strong industrial base, which was put into test and lost some share to China after China joined the WTO in the 2000s. But because of the growth in labor costs in China and the efficiencies developed in Mexico and the gains that they've had with the devaluation of their currency, and the fact that also Mexico has access to cheap shale gas from southern United States, where there's been a lot of pipelines built from Mexico from the U.S. into Mexico. Mexico has been regaining a lot of the maquila share that they had lost to China, and even in an environment where imports into the United States have been slowing down, Mexican exports to the United States have been growing, and they've been gaining market share. So they continue to see more and more investment, not just from the U.S., but from other parts of the world. And I think what you're starting to see slowly is Mexico shift from being purely a country that's focused on exporting to the United States to a country that's looking to export to the world. And I think that's going to be critical for Mexico, because today over 80% of Mexican exports end up in the U.S. If they can diversify further and further away from the U.S., then I think that they're going to become an even more vibrant economy. And if oil continues to recover somewhat, then Mexico also is going to attract a lot of investments into its oil sector, which was opened during the constitutional reforms that President Peña Nieto put through Congress in 2013, 2014. But unfortunately for them, as they went to auction the first of these offerings, obviously oil prices got cut by a quarter. So they haven't been very successful at attracting new investments for that particular sector as much as they expected. But I think that they will be able to get oil prices stabilize in the 50s or even move into the 60s.
To the point that you just discussed, and the difficulties that these foreign investors are complaining regarding to doing business in Brazil, comes this next question. Do you see a time in the not so distant future where exporting consumer goods into Brazil could actually be a competitive exercise? Today, the amount of duties and taxes charged by the government make virtually impossible to compete with Brazilian brands.
I think we need to see first is Brazil. It would probably be a mistake for Brazil to simply open up today for free imports and exports, because the other complexities of the labor law and tax law in Brazil make Brazil a lot less competitive. With the Route 360, if you speak to some of the auto parts industry, for example, in Brazil, they say with the Route 360 they can compete with the rest of the world despite the additional costs of doing business in Brazil. But it's no certainty the real is going to stay at this level, and people aren't going to invest based on that alone. So if real labor and fiscal reform was to come through and reduce the cost of doing business in Brazil to a level that Brazil could then compete more head-to-head with some of the other large economies in the emerging markets, then I think that you could see that happen. But we're years, if not decades, away from Brazil really becoming a major exporter of anything other than natural resources, agribusiness, areas where we have natural advantages no matter what the currency is and what the labor laws and the fiscal laws are.
Very good. I don't know if you followed the news this morning. As you said, things are changed by the day. And this morning, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development cut its economic growth forecast for Brazil, citing political uncertainty and corruption worries. You and I have lived through several economic crises. How this current economic crisis in Brazil is different from previous ones?
I think one of the biggest differences between what happened this time around and what happened in 2008 or even what happened in 2002 when President Lula was being elected, but there was a lot of pressure coming from the outside, or the 1998-1999 crises that were caused by Asia and Russia, is that this was a self-inflicted crisis. This was something that didn't need to happen. Had they stayed with the economic policies that had been followed had been started by President Cardoso and followed at least by the first administration of President Lula, really into the second one, we wouldn't be in this much trouble as we are today. But the fact that you had this new economic matrix that was brought into play by President Rousseff, believing in big government and populist policies that haven't proven to work anywhere in the world at any point. So that's what got us into this trouble. I think it goes back to the pre-Real Plan crisis, where it was really self-inflicted bad politics, bad policies on the fiscal side, which then derailed the monetary policy gains that we've seen for many years. And really, at the end of the day, which makes no sense, is it really ends up hurting the electorate that put those folks in power, because the people that get hurt the most by high inflation, high interest rates, low growth, unemployment going up are the poorer segments of the population, which are the folks that had been most in support of President Lula and then President Rousseff. So, but the fact that this was all self-inflicted or mostly self-inflicted is really what's most different and most puzzling too, because it was really not necessary.
Well, I would like to end this program on a light and inspiring note. Will, here's the final question. You manage a $2 billion portfolio for a global investment fund, travel around the globe, devoted husband and father, but still find time to fill the role of vice chairman of Brazil Foundation, a nonprofit organization that helps to improve the quality of life of poor communities in Brazil. What drives you to do that?
It's just that desire to give back to Brazil. Obviously, everything that I've been able to accomplish in my career, for better or for worse, is because I'm Brazilian, and that's what makes me different, and it has allowed me to have the professional opportunities. So for many years, I was looking for an organization that you could trust, that's doing the right job in terms of helping the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of Brazilians with our grants, and that's what Brazil Foundation does. So Leona Foreman and Patricia Labacaro, the founder and the president, invited me to join them several years ago after I went to one of their galas here in New York. And I'm very happy I wish I had more time to spend with them and be able to help them more, but I'm very happy to be able to be a small part of their organization that's doing amazing things and helping amazing people do amazing things in Brazil. So thanks for mentioning that.